Hello and welcome to another episode of the Alastair Generationally Speaking podcast, where we look at bridging the generation gap by debunking myths, tackling stereotypes and sharing practical tips on how we can build stronger intergenerational connections. And the person I'm talking to today, my guest, knows all about different generational connections with his work. He's the CEO of a wholesale business, Cotswold Fayre, and a retail and restaurant business, Flourish. His company was one of the first B Corps in the UK, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. And he's passionate about sustainability and cultural transformation in organisations, which has led him to writing 2 books, speaking to other businesses, and mostly recently launching a podcast. So I'm here with an expert podcaster. His is called The Fourth Bottom Line. Paul, it's wonderful to have you on the show. Thank you very much indeed for joining me.
Yeah, thanks for having me and look forward to the conversation.
Well, we've got a big conversation and, first of all, Paul Hargreaves, Generation X. Do you see yourself as a typical Gen X or do you think you break the mould?
I think in terms of Gen X is well known for working hard, not taking any prisoners, being resilient, and I think those characteristics are what you need if you're an entrepreneur. It's not a word I probably use about myself that much actually, but I guess I am an entrepreneur, and I know a lot of entrepreneurs in my generation, so in that respect, yes.
So what about your upbringing? Did you have a typical Gen X latchkey kid upbringing?
Well, yeah. I mean, both my parents were doctors, so they weren't around too much at home. In fact, I was just talking to someone the other day that most of the time my parents had no idea where I was. Certainly, obviously, when I was younger they did, but when I was a teenager, we were pretty feral. And I grew up in Manchester. Yeah, I used to mess around in the centre of the city with a friend and get up to all sorts of mischief. Some of it legal.
I think you're probably like me. You're very grateful that social media wasn't around in those days to capture those moments.
Absolutely, yes. Yes.
Well, I can certainly relate to that. I'm not sure my parents would like to say that I was feral, but we were very much left to our own devices.
Yes.
But I was very different. I was on a farm down in Cornwall, so it was a very different upbringing, but actually similar framing in that respect.
Yeah,
and what about as you were growing up? You were obviously growing up in the 80s, and that stuff was a pretty iconic time in many respects, where there was a huge evolution of thought. What was life like for you growing up in that era?
Yeah, well, it was probably 70s. I'm born in '66, so a lot of my growing up was probably late '70s. Went to university mid '80s. Goodness, what was it like growing up? I think. Look, the big thing for me was, again, probably connected to my parents. It took me a long time to kind of work out who I was.
Was there any pressure to go down a particular direction with your career? Being a doctor like them?
No, yes. There quite often isn't there, with doctors? But I think they were both so disillusioned with the health service at the time. They were almost discouraging us from doing that. So one of 3, neither of my siblings went down the medical route either. I did actually do the right A levels to go down that route, but must have been persuaded away from it in the sixth form at school. So. Yeah, I mean, there was a huge value placed on academic performance. I remember coming back home with my A-level results, which was, I'm not boasting here, but I got 3 A's. But then I also did an S level. They probably don't exist now, but I didn't get the top grade in the S, and my dad said, "Well, what went wrong there?" Hang on a minute, I got 3 A's. What's your problem?
And isn't that a difference in the way children are brought up, in where the focus is? and that we're taught today to bring up children in a way that's far more celebratory of the achievements rather than focusing on what wasn't perfect.
Yeah, absolutely. So yes, it did make. Having said that, the reason there are entrepreneurs, disproportionate number, probably in my generation, is it does create drivenness. So, which isn't great, but obviously there is a good side to it. I think the way probably I brought my kids up is they're less likely to be entrepreneurs than I was. So it is swings
Now,
and roundabouts, isn't it?
Now you've got millennial children and Gen Z children, and some people suggest that Gen Z, who are the majority of Gen Z, are Gen X kids of Gen X, and some would suggest that they actually have that entrepreneurial spirit, partly with the side hustles that we hear about and so on. But some of that actually comes from their entrepreneurial Gen X parents. What would you say to that?
Well, currently, just based on the very small sample size of four, none of my children are looking like they're going to be entrepreneurs right now. But having said that, there was one. I mean, one of mine is on the spectrum actually, and he did show signs of being an entrepreneur when he was a kid. So I got a phone call one day when he was at school, and basically the tone of the teachers, I knew something was. I thought, oh no, what the hell has he done? And what it was that he he was buying sweets in Poundland. I think he got his sister to go and buy the sweets in Poundland, and then he was selling them on the bus back from school or to school at an extortionate amount of profit. And he did this for a while without getting rumbled. But yeah, one of the teachers obviously found out about it one day, and was expecting me to condemn him for this dodgy behaviour, and I said, "Well, I think it shows good signs for the future." Actually, I don't think he was
Well,
that
that
pleased.
and that's a really interesting thing, isn't it? Because half of you would want to say, "Oh, exploitation, that's absolutely shocking," but then the other half thinks, "Hey, fair play, that's a bit of
Yeah,
entrepreneurial flair."
exploitation is a bit strong, but kind of 50% profit margin on retail prices is probably a bit excessive.
Now that links that links very well into what you're doing now. The fact that your focus is on sustainability, on cultural transformation. What for somebody who was this Gen X cutthroat business kind of entrepreneur, I'm not saying you were, but
No.
that's the impression we get of that generation. So tell us a little bit about the path that got you to the point where you are now.
Yeah, well, I'm very much not that person actually, because for 12 years I worked in the charity sector before I even thought of running a business. I've only actually been gainfully employed for 3 years of my life, and that was in sales. And straight out of university, I worked in sales for 3 years. Then went into the charity sector, working in the inner city with drug addicts, people who spent most of the time in prison, um, kids who were just lost, and old people as well, actually. So we had a team of people working in a place called Deptford, which is um, in the well, it's near Greenwich, but it was nothing like Greenwich. I think it's been gentrified now, but it was there was 68% single parent families at the time, virtually zero car ownership. It was a desperate place, loads and loads of crime. In fact, some parts of the area the police didn't go to because there was so much crime. It was out of control. So that was funded by various donations from some of the rich friends that I made at Oxford. They felt guilty about going to the city, so they contributed into this trust that was doing something more useful than they were. Um, Eventually, those funds dried out, and I had started a side hustle of the business to help feed my children, and in effect that took over, and there became a point in time, which happened to be 1999, where I decided to actually start the business properly rather than it being a side thing. And so I was very much coming from the world as a mess. Some of the reason it's a mess is business, some is government, local or national. So right from the start of the business, we wanted to give people a chance. And the first, I think 3 of the first 5 employees were people that would be described as unemployable by others. So one was straight out of prison, one was a recovering heroin addict, and one was a recovering alcoholic. So right at the start of the business, it was within the DNA was this isn't just to make money; it's to try and do some good in the world.
And what do you think drove you? Because that certainly is not the stereotype of a Gen X in terms of your career path, and clearly going from something like sales, which is a bit more cut and thrust, and more stereotypical 80s. What was it that drove you to go into the charity sector and to do the work that you did?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I am very competitive. I used to do a lot of sport. Getting a little too old for that now. But so the competitive side has always been there. But at the same time, I've always had, and I've have kind of done a bit of work working out where this comes from. I've always had a very keen sense of being upset about injustice. So back to the upbringing actually. So we lived in a nice suburb of Manchester, but just down the road was the largest council estate in Europe at the time. It won't be now, but a place called Wythenshawe, which is where the royal family is based. If you remember that, probably old enough. In fact, Caroline Ahern went to the next primary school to mine. So I was always very aware that I was from a privileged background, and it was obvious that I was much luckier than many people who lived near me. So, and I probably got, I don't know why, but that upset me as a kid. So yes, that's one of my drivers, and has kind of flowed through a lot of what I've done in my life. Actually, wanting to make the world better, primarily in the kind of people area initially, and then more recently in the environmental area, which obviously affects people. Climate change is killing people in other parts of the world already, and will only get worse. So yes, there has always been a compassionate side within me.
Yeah, and it's always interesting to look at someone's upbringing and what framed them in terms of things that happened in their environment growing up, and for you to see that injustice of nearby people not having what you have. And it's interesting though that you noticed it where others may not have noticed it. So there may be something more in your DNA that also it was a trigger for something that was already there. But looking at the way that you work now, the fact that you're giving people remarkable opportunities that they might not otherwise have, is that still all stemming from that injustice that you saw when you were younger?
Yeah, the golden thread is definitely there. I think probably very naive at the beginning. We tried to do too much too soon. Having 60% of your employees of the initial 5 was too much. The business wasn't sustainable, probably financially, which is never great. So yeah, and coming on to the B Corp. So when I ran across B Corp, so started off the business for a couple of years, ran it with another guy actually, and we very much along the lines we've just talked about. He then left because desperate financial situation. So for the next probably 12 years or so, I was kind of bumbling around, lost that kind of sense of purpose that was there at the beginning. Really was just focusing on having a viable business. So when I did heard about B Corp, which was in about 2014 from another CEO in the food sector, apart from thinking the name was a bit American, I did dig into it and realise that, wow, this is everything I ever thought business should be about. And here are some people that are doing it a lot better than I am. At the time, mainly in the States. And not only were they making a difference to the world, they actually had successful businesses too. So, yeah, we dived straight in, and we were one of the first. There was an initial kind of cohort of 40 B Corps that founded the UK movement, and we were one of those 40.
So, just for those who aren't familiar with B Corp, maybe could you just encapsulate what it is?
So, in one sentence, they're businesses that put people and planet before profit. In three sentences, there's basically three things they have to do. One is legally change their articles of association. That's the documents that are held on companies' house. So legally, those businesses, typically businesses exist only for one purpose, and that's the shareholders. And shareholder primacy is why we've businesses generally have made a mess of the world when there's only one motivation, that's to make shareholders rich. So they've got to change that so their business exists for the benefit of all stakeholders. There's a fairly rigorous certification process which looks at the areas of governance, environment, customers, community, and workers, and you have to get over a certain score in that, and then finally, once you are a B Corp, you have to produce an annual impact report. So, in a nutshell, that's it.
And what was the response from, first of all, your customers, but then your employees when they discovered that you were aiming to become a B Corp and then when you achieved it?
Customers not interested at all at the time. There's many still aren't actually, but there's more that are. Most impact initially was workers. Um, like me, it took them a while to get it, and I would say it probably took us 2 years, maybe three, to kind of embed those values properly in the business. And then suppliers more so, I mean, it will happen in the food and drink space. There is a higher percentage of B Corps than any other sector, actually. So, I mean, we very few, I think maybe two suppliers were B Corps. No, one. I think it was only one before we were. So they were part of that original group. There was one customer, Cook, which is the frozen food company. Now we have over 80 suppliers that are B Corp. So yes, we are attracting those into us, and now there was an initial kind of transformation process, but now people generally, a lot of them come and work for us because we're a B Corp. Because it's a bit more well known now than it's a lot more well known now than it was in 2015, and the last 3
And
years.
how many employees do you have now, and how easy is it to keep a handle on it when you grow and when you get bigger?
So we have over 150 employees. The wholesale business, which is the main kind of financial driver of the business, is only about 40. And in 21 we started this retail side, which we call it food hall and kitchen. Other people call it a farm shop. It is a shop on a farm, but it's not a working farm. It's technical definition. But I was particularly interested to start that, really, with everything I'd learnt in the previous 22 years. Starting a business again and putting that stuff in right at the beginning. It wasn't the only motivation for doing it. I thought we could do a really good job at being a great place to buy food and eat food on site. But the challenge was to start again. No common people. Could we be better right from the beginning? It's obviously a long story, but the answer was a resounding yes, and it was primarily because we've become a lot better at articulating values and making it clear what we were about, and we just attracted a load of great people into the business, which mainly were millennials and Gen Z.
So yeah, let's talk about them because they are very different. I mean, okay, yes, they're the same as your own children, but somehow we view our own children somewhat differently to we view other people's children. So how did you get on with the different generations? What were the positives and what were maybe some of the challenges that you experienced being a Gen X?
I think with that business, the wholesale business. There's hardly anyone in this office today. It's just before Easter, but when it's busy, there's just people sitting in front of screens. With the retail and hospitality side, obviously most people's job isn't sitting in front of a screen. It's it's interacting with customers and when you're with your colleagues. So I think in many ways it's much easier to kind of pass on the values of a business when there's a lot more human interaction, and I think it's a lot easier for those younger generations to catch and to get what we're doing. I mean, an example is actually my own children who don't work there, but they, as you do if you're a business owner, and when they haven't, part of child minding is to take them into the business and make them do something useful, which I used to do at Christmas, particularly when we were making up hampers, and some of them were better than others at doing that. But when we opened Flourish, which is the retail side, and soon after that, I think three of them came for lunch one day, and it was like suddenly the scales fell from their eyes, and Dad, we get it. After all this time, they got it just from the interaction of the people and how people were in the business and how the service was. So I think it's a lot easier to catch those values when you're in a business where humans are interacting with each other than it is when it's basically just sitting in front of spreadsheets all day.
So a couple of things come out of that I'm thinking of. One is, what's your view about working from home and having people work in a hybrid environment? And then, I'll come to the second in a moment. So what's your view on hybrid working?
Um, yeah. So people are in 2 days a week currently. I am thinking of, or we are thinking of increasing that. So my view on hybrid working, it's great for many people. Obviously, those with children, particularly pets, etc. The people that have struggled with hybrid working are those who the younger one. There's a 19-year-old who's just started working here, actually fantastic, lives with her parents, but I know she much prefers to be in the office than working at home. I think both her parents also work at home, so you can imagine it gets a bit crowded. So yes, we're doing it because the pressure's there to do it. I think we need a bit more collaboration time, and there's some days like today when there's just not enough people here to make it other people worthwhile coming in. So we have one day that everyone has to be here, which is Tuesdays. So that's your kind of big collaboration day, and then they can choose another day. The office is shut on Fridays. We do though. Before we brought in the must be here on Tuesdays rule, we'd have one day a month where it's called a company day, where there's no pressure to. I mean, some people have to do stuff, obviously, but there's less pressure to work, which I put in inverted commas because I think interacting with your colleagues is work. But there's no pressure to produce. You can go out for long lunches, you can go out for coffee, and we always have one of our suppliers always cooks us lunch in that time. There's normally some kind of fun activity as well. There's a longer meeting so we can communicate better. So I think all that stuff is just done much, much better face to face. So, I mean, personally, because I shared childcare, I've always been hybrid, actually. I always worked at home Tuesdays and Fridays. I probably didn't didn't allow the other people in the team to do that for some reason. But so yeah, I think for certain jobs there is a time when you need to get your head down, just focus, and in a busy office. And there's a lot of laughter and fun here. It's not always easy, and we have quite a few neurodiverse people in the business, particularly for them. It's not always easy to focus when you're in a busy office. So I think a hybrid model is the best of many worlds.
Yeah, and a lot of it, as you say, there is horses for courses, and very quickly the other aspect of your business where you're dealing with retail, and that involves interactions between individuals and so on. Again, we hear Gen Z, that's not their forte, that's not their strength. What would you say to that?
Yeah, so obviously what I just said about hybrid is only in the wholesale side. The retail and hospitality, you can't work in a kitchen
Yeah.
from home. So everyone is in all the time with that business. It's a very important point there. I wish schools did more on this, because so one thing I have noticed is that those younger generations, you say, have you spoken to so and so? They said, yeah, I've spoken to them. They haven't. They've just sent them a message or dropped them an email. They haven't actually spoken to them. So because you're right. We're not equipping people to have those proper human reactions. So in many ways, what we're doing in the retail business, that is a lot of it, is to deliver good service. You've got to talk to your customers, and we have incentive schemes to people that get shouted out in reviews by name gets rewards and stuff like that. But yes, the team that work there, a lot of their time is taken in developing those proper human connections, because you can't be a good retailer or a good restaurant without that.
Yeah, and obviously you're doing a fantastic job at training and to pick up the slack where maybe the education system isn't
Yeah,
providing
yeah,
that.
and
One of the things,
sorry, I was just going to
yeah,
say,
sorry, carry on.
it is. I mean, the most encouraging thing for me really is when you see a review or you hear a conversation and people are noticing that difference. That is wow.
Yeah.
Okay, it's working. Brilliant.
One of the things that we hear all the time is that it's Gen Z and millennials who are driving essentially what's behind B Corp, in terms of cultural transformation, in terms of the environment and so on. Is that your experience? Who's leading that, and how much is it being talked about but not necessarily being seen in action?
I think I think quite a few of the initial B Corps are people my kind of age. Actually, the huge explosion we've seen more recently is there's almost a pressure, certainly within the food and drink sector, that if you are starting a new dynamic food or drink company, you need to look at B Corp. So there's almost a kind of a kind of covert pressure to sign up and certainly explore it, if not become one. And I think that I do a bit of mentoring, and there are some fantastic young people starting great businesses that have purpose right at the core of them. Brilliant. So yes, there are a lot of authenticity there with the entrepreneurs. I think probably you're maybe talking about the people who aren't running those businesses, who are kind of saying they're living a sustainable life and maybe aren't. And yeah, that is also true to some degree. But we can't ever separate the environmental side of this with the social side. To make good food that's healthy for people, that's good quality, where animals aren't getting abused, costs money. So I wish 100% of the UK was eating food like that. in reality, the food we're supplying is really only to the 10% richest part of the demographic of the UK. But most people can't afford the stuff we do, which is a tragedy. So I get it if people sometimes talk a talk and do a different walk, because there's huge financial pressure on young people. They can't buy a house for at least 10 years later than we probably bought houses. It's a massive issue, and it's not. The whole sustainability argument gets whittled down to an individual choice. It obviously that's part of it, but we're not going to see true change until there's a whole systemic change, which will involve government policy. Not really happened yet, but it also involves businesses doing the right thing. And I think when enough businesses are making those right choices, there will be increasing pressure on government to make some better decisions than they are currently.
Paul, we could have a conversation for another 3 hours on this, and I feel like we've only just scratched the surface. But I have to finish off with just one final question, which would be, very briefly, when it comes to generational cohesion, which I'm sure is very much at the heart of what you do as being a B Corp, what would you say is one of the biggest things that any organisation can do to create that generational cohesion?
A short answer to that is get people to talk to each other. I saw some stat the other day about how little, can't remember the numbers, but how little the older generations in the business talk to the younger ones and vice versa. So yeah, I mean, we have lots of collaborative meetings here that involve people from different teams, and having the older people also know they can learn from the younger generations. It's often seen as one-way traffic. I've got more experience than you, I'll tell you how to do it. No, that's very old school. I think if we have a curiosity within all the people in the business that they can all learn from each other, whether they're older or younger than them, I think we'd have a better workplace and a more complete multi-generational workforce.
Brilliantly put, Paul. It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. Very briefly, how can people find out more about you and your work?
Well, I found out the other day, if you type Paul Hargreaves into Google, I'm think I'm 8 or 9 of the top 10 listings, but if that might change. So if you go to paulhargreaves.co.uk, there's links there to most of the other things I do.
And we'll put them all in the show notes as well. Paul, thank you so much again. It's been a real pleasure talking to you, and I've learned a huge amount from you today, and continue with that fantastic work that you're doing. You're an inspiration to every organisation out there who should be seeking the same B Corp status. Thank you also for joining us, for listening to this podcast. We'll be back again in 2 weeks. In the meantime, thanks very much. Bye for now. The Alastair Greener Generationally Speaking podcast was presented by me, Alastair Greener. It was recorded at Granary Studios and produced by James Jones. Please follow us and leave us a review wherever you get your podcasts. To find out more, visit generationallyspeaking.co.uk.